Hello everybody, today we're going to chat about data transport usage on the Bridge API platform. My name is Kevin and I'm the Senior Product Manager for Bridge API out of Vancouver, Canada. The Bridge API is a data distribution platform built to work alongside MLS software, and it gives MLSs transparency and fine-grained control over their data access. So today I'm going to share some insights into how data is being consumed on the Bridge API platform. On our platform, there are three data transports that consumers can choose from. There's the Bridge Native API, Virtual RETs, and the RESO Web API. The Bridge Native API is our original proprietary API that's been available since before the RESO spec was implemented. It's just a simple, RESTful web API familiar to most software developers. Virtual RETs is a vanilla RETs 1.9 implementation available to any of the developers who have been approved for data access. And effectively what it allows them to do is to continue to use RETs as a data transport in markets that no longer have a dedicated RETs server. And then lastly, the RESO Web API you all know very well. But there are two ways that people are using it. They're either making on-demand queries to our database, or they're replicating an entire data set and keeping it in sync. So we strongly believe that MLSs, in support of their members, should have the authority over what data is being given and to who it's being given. But the decision about what data transport to use should be made by the ones who have to implement the data ingestion and maintain the software that it's powering. To that end, once a developer has been approved by the MLS for the appropriate data access, they are able to pick whichever they prefer and change it at will, and even use combinations of the three, since they all have slightly different capabilities. On our platform, there's no end of life specified for virtual RETs, so developers can keep using RETs for as long as they want to. And they can change over to the RESO Web API whenever they feel comfortable. And the last thing we're talking about is replication. While we do allow developers to choose which data transport they use, we do still let the MLSs decide whether or not they're allowed to replicate the data sets. This is really a nod to one of the original promises of the Web API, which was kind of designed to discourage duplication of the data. So what are we actually going to be looking at in this presentation? Well, firstly, we wanted to share what choices we are seeing developers make in terms of data transports while using the platform. Are they going to stick with RETs? Are they going to adopt the RESO Web API? Or are they going with our native RESTful API? And then what we want to do is just zero in on the RESO Web API specifically and see what methods they're using to get the data. Are they making these on-demand queries, or are they choosing to replicate and maintain an entire data set themselves? So a couple of things to bear in mind. Some of these MLSs, not all of them, but some of them, we aren't the only data distribution platform. And so we can't speak to the total number of data consumers in the market, of course, only the ones that come through our platform. And then secondly, just to point out, we don't really encourage devs to go one way or the other. We give them the choice. They can choose whichever one is most suitable for their needs. So we gathered the data that we're going to look at from the last 6 months of activity on the platform. And really we just focused on our 5 most active MLSs. We decided not to name any of the MLSs, so instead we just labeled them by their membership count. And we've got quite a nice spread there, actually. We've got some big MLSs and some small ones. So the first thing we're going to look at is the data transports. So virtual RETs, firstly, we see this being used typically by established companies that have an existing ingestion infrastructure. And so, the bigger vendors, the nationwide brokers, as well as, of course, the portals. It's also fairly popular, we're finding, with some of the smaller shops that aren't necessarily real estate industry specific, but who are wanting to use those tools that have been built against RETs over the last decade. So things like people coming on wanting to use a WordPress plugin, for example. Then with the RESO Web API, we are seeing a fair amount of these sort of more established companies actually starting to consume the Web API, certainly over the last year. And any newcomers to the industry are, as expected, going straight for the Web API, which is great. And then lastly, the Bridge native API. What we see there tends to be users who have been on our platform prior to the Web API being introduced and available. But what we do see is pretty much all of the new users tend to go straight for the RESO Web API in preference over the Bridge one. So taking a look at the actual numbers, the great news for RESO is that the majority of users on our platform are opting to use the RESO Web API. You'll notice 2 of the MLSs have around 30% of devs still using the Bridge API. This is most likely because those 2 MLSs specifically have been on the platform a lot longer than the others. And you've got developers on there whose integrations would have been built out before the RESO Web API was available or popular. The other thing to see is that there are a decent number of folks still using, or rather taking advantage of the virtual RETs on the Bridge platform. In particular, in that smallest MLS, we see 26% there. That's most likely because that MLS no longer offers a native RET server in that market. So the other metric we're sharing here is how users are actually choosing to use the RESO Web API. For better or for worse, the RESO Web API wasn't really designed with data replication in mind as a primary use case. And while it is capable of it, the way that MLS system vendors and API platforms have implemented the ability to replicate is slightly different. So on the Bridge platform, replication means, through the RESO Web API, is handled with a dedicated endpoint. This is an endpoint that will allow devs to pull more records at once per query, as well as have slightly higher offsets and rate limits. The MLS, again, is able to choose who's allowed to use this replication endpoint on a user-by-user basis. But what we do see is, for the most part, it is allowed. It's pretty rare for us to see MLSs restricting users to only on-demand queries. Now, this time last year, during a presentation at the Spring RESO conference, we did a live poll to ask audience members what method of data ingestion they would use when using the RESO Web API. And so out of 72 responses, we had 19% saying they would use on-demand queries, 22% saying they would go for full replication, and what was surprising to us at the time, 58% they said that they would use a combination of both. So this is how the numbers have actually played out for the folks choosing to use the RESO Web API. What we see is about 25% of the data consumers are replicating, about 60% are making on-demand queries, and only about 10% actually using a combination of both. Another way to think about this means that at least a third of the developers on the platform are using the ability to replicate data while integrating with the RESO Web API. So that's just a little peek into the user behavior that we see on the Bridge API platform. And there's a few conclusions that we can draw. Firstly, RETs is still used by a good number of users, as expected. And in particular, they are the more established companies with more complex data ingestion engines. But what we do see is that the RESO Web API is starting to become a more successful alternative, and we are seeing more of those companies move over. Secondly, an industry standardized API is a far more popular choice than a platform-specific proprietary API. Now that's probably obvious, and there's a few reasons for that, but it does certainly validate all the hard work done by the transport work group. And then lastly, replication, very important to a large percentage of Web API users. No doubt we're going to see that percentage increase as more established vendors move off RETs and onto the Web API. And so to that end, I would encourage folks to join the work groups and contribute to the new replication spec and help make their own lives easier a little bit further down the road. Thank you.